I can't assume that we all know who the Open University is, where are we based, what we do. So I thought I would give you a bit of a rundown of some of the key factors around the Open University. So the Open University is the largest university in the UK. In fact, we have over 205,000 former students. 34% of our new undergraduate students are under the age of 25. 26% of our students are from deprived areas. 34% of our students entered their courses with one A level or less, and 3 out of 5 of our students are already in work. And furthermore, 1 in 6 of our students has a disability. So all in all, we have a sort of a community of learners of over 2.2 million. I'm obviously speaking from the Open University Business School, but the Open University Business School is part of the Faculty of Business and Law. So as it happens, if people can pick it up from my, I'm wearing a tag here. This year, the Open University Business School is marking the 40th anniversary of the business school. We have 108,000 alumni from 125 countries, and we have over 28,000 people have done their MBAs with the OU Business School. As of the law school, which is part of the Faculty of Business and Law, it's celebrating its 25th anniversary with over 60,000 students over the last 25 years. I should also, say one or two things about the business school. It is triple accredited, so we are a leader in the industry in terms of business schools. In terms of promo, let me stop there and say one or two things about the conference and how it came about. And hopefully, over time, you tell me why you chose to join us today. So the cost of living crisis is something which we have been hearing a lot about. We read the press, in our conversation, when you go to the supermarket and realize that we are getting less for the same amount of money we spent last year or otherwise. But the voluntary sector is somewhere in the intersection where obviously the community, the businesses meet the government, meet society. So that's why we felt we needed to talk about it. The event today is structured in we divide the session into 3. We will start with looking at the impact of the cost of living crisis on voluntary sector organizations, and we have 2 great speakers who will be introduced very shortly. So when we finish, we will move to a section where we'll be looking at the impact of the cost of living crisis on the communities, because I can't assume there is one community. We have specifically decided to look at the impact of the cost of living crisis on communities of racialized minorities. The reason being that the cost of living crisis came in the aftermath of COVID, and we know it disproportionately impacted on racialized minorities, but also because since 2020, obviously today is the day when we remember the death of George Floyd at the hands of those who are meant to protect him. It's very important to think about racial equity as the UK and most Western societies have become very diverse, which has implications and making sure that everybody is actually benefiting from the wealth we have in this country, but also making sure nobody is left behind. So the wealth is shared. So that's why the word equity is very important. In the afternoon, we will have a session on the impact of the economic crisis on volunteering in the voluntary sector. I'm conscious of the fact that some of the people I know, I've known for years, have not been able to volunteer as much as they did in the past, for example, because they are still shielding from because of COVID. Others have had to take up jobs in order to balance the books. So I'm very sure that our speakers will be telling us and giving us more insight about what is happening out there. And we are here to listen and learn. We don't have all the solutions. We'll be counting on you during the day to give us some feedback on what you are going to hear. Tell us what you are going to do differently as a result of the conference. Make some suggestions about, for example, what you'd like us to do next year and the years to come, but also maybe some areas of research where we should be investing time and energy. So we are open. We don't have all the solutions, and we will be sharing with you some of the work we are doing at the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership over time. That will be through me and through my colleagues who are going to be chairing the sessions. And as we, as we will not be sort of unmuting yourselves, the guest, or even allowing them to use the mic, so you will be using the chat to communicate with us and share with us your thoughts and your insights. And can I suggest that when we do it, obviously, let's try and be courteous, be respectful. So, and I'm hoping that we'll remain civil. I know we are, it's important that even when you are online, that we behave ourselves. Hopefully, I'm preaching to the choir, so I don't need to say a lot about that. But certainly, I'm hoping that we will have a great day, and I'm excited, just like everybody else. And I am looking forward to some discussions. And more importantly, I'm hoping to see some of you in the networking session this afternoon, when you will be able to speak to some of the speakers if they manage to stay around for the day. So obviously, enjoy the session. We have got enough breaks, and we are using one room, so you don't have to log in and out. When you take a break, just you can leave your machine on, and then when you come back, you join the same room. So nothing is changing. We are not going to be bringing you into breakout rooms. Everything is going to happen here. I can see already some ideas are popping up on my screen as I speak. It's great to continue to engage, and we want to get as many responses as possible. So when we have a pause, please, by all means, do share your thoughts and your views. It is highly appreciated. And obviously, we will be keen to find out how you are prepared or otherwise to engage with us going forward, because we are delighted to have you, but would like to have this one here as the beginning of a conversation, not the end. So because you chose to spend some time with us, we expect you get a lot from the session, but also we expect you to continue to engage with us, whether it is through our research, through our knowledge exchange activities, whether it is webinars or conferences in the future, but also through our teaching, which is formal and informal, So one of the statistics which I didn't share is that the Open University, we have got an open land platform where people can go and access our courses for free, which is part of our social mission. And uh, we have been very successful in terms of engaging with people. As an example, by 2016, 2.7 million people had downloaded some of our work on Amazon, on Kindle, as an example. So we are there. Please engage with us. Continue, stay in touch, and thank you very much for listening to me. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to ask my colleague uh, Carol to turn on her camera, and she'll be looking after my colleagues who are going to be part of the first panel. So, I'm giving you about 2 minutes, Carol, just in case I don't have to use all the 15 minutes. Over to you, and you can introduce our guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fidèle. Good to hear from Fidèle this morning with that welcome. I'm Carol Jacklin-Jarvis. I'm a senior lecturer in the OU Business School and a former director of Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership, the task which Fidèle took over from me recently. And it's my enormous privilege to chair this first session with two absolutely outstanding speakers, whose names I think you will all know well. And we're talking about the impact of cost of living crisis on voluntary sector organisations. Please do use the chat and type in your questions. There will be a Q&A session after this, and also a little bit of a wrap from me, but also we'll keep coming back to your questions through the day if we can't deal with them all in each session. So it is I'm going to introduce both speakers, and Paul is going to speak first, and then Paul, I will at some point pop back in and say your time is up, and then we're going to go over to Ed. So Paul Streets, first of all. Paul Streets, as many of you will know, is Chief Executive of Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales, where he arrived after a career which spanned the voluntary and public sector and work in social care, international development, human rights, public health, professional and service regulation, and health and social care. So really wide-ranging experience, Paul. He's been Chief Executive of Diabetes UK, the Health Development Agency, and the Postgraduate Medical Education and Training Board, and was a senior civil servant in the Department of Health, working on public and patient engagement. Many other roles that Paul brings to his experience before coming to the Lloyds Bank Foundation. And we're really excited, Paul, to hear your talk, which you've titled, really interestingly, Funding in an Immaterial World. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then we're going to hear from Ed Mayo. Ed is Chief Executive of Pilotlight, a charity that amplifies the impact charities, business and individuals can bring to make a better world. And many of you, like me, will know of charities that have received advice and support from Pilotlight. Pilotlight has helped over 1,000 charities who tackle social disadvantage to ignite change that lasts. And Ed has led the development of a diverse range of civil society organisations, including Cooperatives UK, the National Consumer Council, and the New Economics Foundation. And Ed's talk is on the impact of the economic crisis on the finance of voluntary sector organisations and the difficult choices they're having to make. So welcome, Paul and Ed. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to hear first from Paul, and then Paul, I'll jump in at some point to make sure that we keep to time, which we're doing so well. But really looking forward to hearing from both of you. Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Carol, and thanks, Fidèle. I'll come to Material World. You can see me, I guess. Can you just put your thumb up? Yeah, you can see me. Good. OK. So I'm a fan of the OU. I'm really honoured to be asked, actually, to speak to such an auspicious group and an important institution like the OU, partly because of the access you provide to people who otherwise wouldn't have access. I actually studied my first management training in Kenya, and I see we've got somebody from Tanzania on the line. Hi, Adam, from Jambo in Tanzania. So I studied your first management module in Kenya. Anyway, so funding in the material world, I'm going to come to that in a moment, Carol, but I'm going to start with, first of all, a foundation view. And towards the end, I'm going to give some very personal reflections on the sector as somebody who loves the sector, but has worked with it off and on for about 4 decades. I'm not going to use any slides, but you will need to stay awake because I'm going to flash various things in front of you. So, you know, you can't switch off your cameras. You must pay attention, but no slides. You're going to get plenty of slides through this program, so I'm not going to do that. So why funding in an immaterial world? Well, I'm going to come to that. But first of all, some basics for us. First of all, because there's some international people on, it's important to say we're a UK-based funder. We are wholly supported by Lloyds Bank, but independent of them. And independent of them is evidenced in 3 ways. Only 4 of my trustees come from the bank, 8 are independent. Our chair is independently selected, and we have a funding agreement with the bank that secures 9 years rolling funding. So we are pretty independent. We work with the bank where it makes sense, particularly around skills-based volunteering, subject of another talk. So our current strategy, we fund small to medium-sized local organisations based in the UK. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, in a bit more detail. But particularly we're focused on specialist organisations focused on inclusion, and our threshold for small is £500,000. So we don't fund anything that's over £500,000 with our responsive work. We do a range of influencing work and a range of working communities alongside that. So why funding in the material world? Well, some of the young people on the call might think I'm masquerading as Madonna, but if you could see me on the camera, I'm not masquerading as Madonna. I'm not the material girl, but I am a great fan of George Harrison. And in the 1970s, he wrote an album, which I love actually, called Living in the Material World. And he did this when he had been raising money after the Bangladesh famine. You remember the war between East and West Pakistan at the time and the famine that fell out of that. And he talked about in the 70s how hard it was to raise cash. And remember, this was before the oil crisis in 1976. This was earlier in that decade. And it feels to me, when we look at it, I'm not making comparisons with Bangladesh, but when we look at the UK today, for many of the people we're trying to reach at the foundation, it must feel like they're living in a completely immaterial world. So I'll come to that in a moment. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. First of all, what we are hearing from those we support. Ed will talk about that in more detail, so I won't labour it. Secondly, how we have responded and how I think we should respond. And thirdly, putting this in the greater context, some big questions I'll leave with you for us as a funder and the sector in the UK in particular. And I hope, Fidèle, that will tee up Carol, some of the things you're going to be discussing during the course of the next 2 days. I'm going to range widely. I'm going to talk about micro issues and macro issues. I'm going to try to touch on things that I think are practical and I hope are useful to those of us on the call who might be grant makers or grant takers. And I'm going to give, as I say, some personal reflections, even perhaps polemic, as somebody who has been a voluntary sector watcher for several decades. I'm going to raise questions, some of which I can't answer, but hopefully you will answer them during the course of the next day. So my first area, what are we hearing from? We fund about 600 local small organisations focused broadly on social justice. Half of them specialised organisations, areas like domestic abuse, homelessness, refugees, sex work, charities. Half of them focused on race equity and disability, which is where we're at. Well, if you look at what we're hearing, and we get a report every quarter, so it's pretty live, this data, frankly, everything you hear is true. It is pretty awful out there if you are running a small local charity in the UK, anywhere in the UK now, probably worse in England than it is in Scotland and Wales, but pretty awful wherever you are. First, we had COVID. And during that, we had Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to return to that several times during the course of this talk. And now we've got the cost of living crisis, which is the topic that you're discussing in the next couple of days. And your all personal level of horror will depend on your graduation of awfulness, because it depends how many of the multipliers are laid upon you in terms of disadvantage. I mean, I suspect in truth, for most of us on this call, it's an inconvenience. Energy bills might have gone up, maybe our mortgages have gone up. But actually, if you start with being in poverty already having a cost of living crisis, even before we had this one, and you're an ex-prisoner, or you're a refugee, or you're working as a sex worker, or you're homeless, or you're facing domestic abuse, it's pretty disastrous. And I could be really cataclysmic about small local organisations who are on the receiving end, because if you look at what we're hearing from them, their demand is up, their income is down, there is stress and pressure on staff, volunteers are hard to recruit. You're talking about that, I think, tomorrow or later today. There are financial pressures that both magnified and marginalised people in equal measure. They magnify those pressures because of the finances, and they already further marginalised those who frankly were already marginalised even before we had COVID. And at a time of pressure, most of us in this room will retreat to the family first. It's what happens. It's natural. We've seen it. So we see a drop in fundraising income. We see a drop in volunteering by people retreating back to their families. But frankly, most of the people we're trying to reach through our work will not have families to support them. Their families are almost part of the problem. So if you're on the receiving end of many of these 600 organisations we fund, which are pretty typical of tens of thousands of small charities across the UK, it is pretty bleak. And we get these feedback from charities every quarter, as I said. And the message, I guess, is that they are not down. And it's surprising for me because they continue to adapt. And what we saw in COVID, which shouldn't have surprised us, but perhaps did, was we saw charities really adapting, going digitally. I had a sex worker charity that was talking about now having 31 consulting rooms when it had to have one, because it was doing them all online. Learning disabilities charities that were initially really challenged, but actually really adapted what they did for the current context. So I guess what our story tells us is that small, medium-sized charities are very effective at being entrepreneurial and adapting. But that doesn't mean they're going to thrive, but it does mean most will survive. And they're adapting in different ways. In our reports, we're seeing lots of different ways they're adapting. We're seeing roles being merged. We're seeing waiting lists. I mean, waiting lists in the charitable sector. I mean, we see them in the public sector, but what we're seeing is charities being really creative about how they respond to that. Charities that support survivors of domestic abuse and sexual abuse in the Southwest, who are now doing triage systems that enable some very light touch counselling, because their waiting list will grow to 2 years for people who face sexual abuse. Trauma counselling in the northeast of England, where we see waiting lists, and they're innovating in terms of automatic text control, bringing people in to do some really basic support, triaging effectively in the voluntary sector. I mean, extraordinary, actually, we're seeing that, which we've seen for years. But those responses in terms of adaptation are really typical. And we saw that, and here's my first flash, with the report we did with the Open University. Here's the plug. The value was small. So in 2017, and they're going to put these links online for you, we produced a report called The Value of Small that talked about the importance of small organisations, not just in respect of who they reached, but actually their economic footprint on some of the poorest parts of Britain, which was a really, really important report for us. And in 2020, during the midst of the COVID crisis, we did report 2. Again, you'll get this. The value of small in a big crisis, flash number 2. Again, you'll get that link. We asked what difference had they made? And actually what that showed is how these small organizations at a time of crisis, whether it's COVID or cost of living, stuck around and they were there working for local people. So I feel positive about small charities and their response, but it comes with a real cost. The first cost is recruitment retention. Many are reliant on contract income, which cannot keep pace with the cost of living. We see in stress, particularly senior leaders. We do a range of support, as do Pilotlight, and Ed will talk about that in a moment, to support organisations. And we're seeing a lot of need for mental health support for senior leaders in small local charities. And if we look ahead, and we see this in the macro context, beyond the next election, if you like, for those of us who were the children of Thatcher, as I was, after decades of funding restraint, we had that breath of fresh air when Tony Blair arrived on the scene, and we thought 1997, the taps are going to be turned back on. And to some degree, they were, actually. And we saw that increase in public spending. And in particular, we saw a lot of money flow both into the public sector, but also to the voluntary sector, because of the pragmatism of the Blair government about working with who they thought was best able to provide support. And that's one of the reasons the voluntary sector got larger, in particular contract income, in that period of the late 90s and the 80s. But if we look at 2023, we're just not in the same place. This may be a really tough message for those of us on the call, but I'm a one-time economist. And if you look at where we're at, I think economic reality has really hit home. We've got quantitative easing. We've lived with that. It's gone. There's no cheap money anymore, either personal or political. We've seen inflation growth through the roof and no growth. We're seeing geopolitical pragmatism, which meant that actually partly our economy was driven by cheap labour elsewhere. Now we're looking at security rather than prices. So I think prices are going to continue. We know that prices hit the poorest the worst. And on top of that, we have climate change. So I think the 2020s look really, really different to those days when we had that shift in 1997. And COVID and Ukraine and Brexit may have compounded it, but it was there anyway. Because if you look at the macroeconomics and the demographics, we have an aging population. They're demanding more and more health and social care. They're especially the elderly in the complex. We have a declining tax base. And we're likely to see a prevailing economic backdrop for some time that I think is pretty bleak. Because even if energy costs settle down, and they will do so in a marginal way, they're still going to be high and they will affect the poorest the worst. So my take home is bleak, actually. It's suddenly not going to change, whoever gets elected or re-elected. And I'll think about how I think we should respond to that. So firstly, my second area, what's to be done? So if I look at us as a funder, and I'll start with the micro, the job of a funder is actually pretty simple. It's essentially about rationing. That's what we are. We're a rationing organisation. We could fund tens of thousands of organisations. We fund 600. So unless you're Welcome or the National Lottery Community Fund, we have to prioritise. And we have done a lot to think about how we prioritise and set criteria that enable us to manage demand around those big three issues for us. One, the cost of living. Second, responding to the aftermath of COVID. And third, around inclusion, and particularly the deep inequality that we saw riven through the economy during COVID, and the impact particularly on Black, Asian and ethnic minority people. So for us, we prioritise, and that's why in our strategy we've gone back to supporting organisations with less than 500,000, because that's what we think we're best, and while we focused on what we think we do best, which is fund specialist organisations, and a particular focus on inclusion. Half our funding now goes towards inclusion, which is trying to reach the most disadvantaged communities, particularly Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities and people who are disabled, which we saw through COVID were very severely impacted. And what we've done, and again, the third flash for me is try to reflect some of our learning and thinking within our new strategy. This is the third document I refer to, lessons from funders, good practice. And we tried to put together 8 lessons from our work about how we should respond as a funder. And the big take home was to acknowledge those trade-offs. You are going to be rationing if you're a funder. Acknowledge those trades-off. The second is use all your assets. We're not endowed. If you're endowed, it's how you use the endowment. I'll come to that in a moment. The third was equity requires action. There's a number of actions there. It was a useful report if you're a funder and probably worth a look. So when I'm talking about rationing, it's prioritisation. It's all very well for me as a funder to say that, but I'm not running a domestic abuse charity where somebody's turned up at my door experiencing domestic abuse and I'm telling them they have to wait 12 months or 2 years before they get it. So I'm going to come on, Carol, to the third area, which is step back and look at the wider questions for us as a funder and as a sector. Because I think COVID revealed for us in stark terms what we frankly already should have known. We have real class and race segregation in the United Kingdom. There were winners, and the winners were those of us, like most of us on this call, because we're all virtual, who could work at home, who could capitalise on flexible working. The losers who had no choice but to turn up for work, many working in the public sector. And we saw that the impacts on them, race and inequality written right into that. You only need to look at the data on mortality to recognise that the people who died, frankly, I mean, the deaths right across the community, but the highest rate of death was among Black and South Asian groups, because they were in that low-wage economy. We actually have a real class and race issue in Britain. COVID jolted us into a recognition of that, but it's rooted deep in our national history with slavery. And it should have been right in our faces, frankly. I think we should be embarrassed as funders that we've not really clocked how significant this was. And COVID woke us up. It was the wake-up call. Because even if you look at our recent history, if you juxtaposition the impact of a decade of austerity post-2008 on those at the bottom, culminating in the cost of living crisis, with the fantastic returns on capital in booming stock markets since 2008, and the impact on endowments for foundations, which largely have gone up, albeit not more recently, capital has been rewarded at the expense of labour, and we're seeing that right written through the economy. I think it actually makes it pathetic, that doorstep banging. It's embarrassing. We were happy to doorstep bang for those who are public sector workers, happy to, as a nation, to patronise the poorest. We're not happy to pay them properly. And I think it begs fundamental questions for us as a funder, because we're like gods. We're like the friars of monks of medieval England dispensing alms, deciding who gets and who doesn't. And yet, for many of us, the very source of our wealth is derived from that inequality of the past, where our wealth is. And we saw that contemporaneously played out in 21st century Britain during COVID with Black Lives Matter. So as funders, I think that raises some really fundamental questions. What do we do about the historic wealth that we have if we're endowed? And thank God we're not endowed. And its origins. It's not just tinkering around the edges on ESG, frankly, it's something more fundamental. What does it mean about power? Who makes decisions? How are decisions made by funders? Who decides? What does it mean about many of our liberal, if uncomfortable, concepts of social justice, when actually what we saw through Black Lives Matter was anger, real anger about injustice in British society from people who frankly will never get near the boards of foundations like mine? At our worst, funders are the very embodiment of power and privilege, just as our 17th and 18th century forebears were in positions of power in their devotion to empire, albeit dispensing patronage. And at our worst, as funders, we get confused between whether our purpose is to grow endowment for the future or to spend money on need today. So it's a pretty tough issues for us as funders. And these are all rooted in poverty and inequality, whether that's domestic or whether it's international. The refugee crisis is as much a crisis as homelessness in Stockport or Southend or wherever it might be. And these are political questions with frankly big and a little p, because the nation, I think, is at a point where we have some political choices to make. in the context of this broader debate of cost of living. And as funders, we can never have the answer. We can only ever be the sticking plaster. But we cannot ignore the need of poverty today, but all we can be is a sticking plaster. We need to focus on the drivers that cause these issues in the first place. And in doing that, we can't be blind to the deep inequality and inequity that lies at the heart of contemporary Britain today. If you are black, brown, gay, trans, refugee, ex-con, or you're disabled, or you're just different, compared frankly to being like me, white, middle class, well-educated, proper extended family who support me if things go wrong. But we cannot be as funders the agent of change, because we would simply replicate the power structures and patronage that cause some of those problems. We have no mandate, we have no membership, we have no points of influence. So what does it mean for those of us who care about the sector and what we do, as I do passionately and have done for 4 decades of my working life? Well, yes, it does mean looking at our wealth and how we deploy it. Not just a bit of ESG, frankly, but it means fundamentally looking at the source of that wealth and what that means for what we do, whether it's reparations to people like Joseph Voluntary considering, or whatever it might be. It means fundamentally looking at who is making decisions. What's the makeup of our boards? How are decisions made in our organisations? Do we simply replicate the power and privilege that we saw in the past, in the 17th, 18th century? Or we're going to look for a more contemporary way of looking at this that reflects the inequality that is right in our faces? We have to recognise this. To me, if the dilemma at the heart of philanthropy is encapsulated by the Open Society Foundation. Here's my fourth and last flash, and this is the front page of their website, and it says the Open Society Foundations work to build vibrant, inclusive democracies whose governments are accountable to their people. Now, as a person in society, I have no problem with that message, but I do struggle with whether a wealthy individual, however benign they might be promoting democracy in another country. Frankly, I think it gives people like Putin and Orban an own goal. But I think it does raise some questions for us, because I think it means for me, as funders, we should be considering funding movements. We should be thinking about funding advocacy work. We should be thinking about funding organisations that can influence and change the dialogue, so that actually what matters in Britain isn't just capital, it's compassion, it's caring for others. It's a civil society that cares about the poorest society and wants to do something about it, whether they're refugees arriving on a boat, or they're homeless people or sex workers in Stockport. So I think Soros does tell us something, because for me this means unrestricted funding to institution building, to organisations that can create change for the future, because independent unrestricted funding, which we have in spades, is the gold dust that enables them to step back outside of the system, regardless of the government today, in a way which state-contracted organisations simply cannot. And one of the consequences of the 1997 post-Blair era is that so many of us have become too dependent on the state. The first charity I worked with then had an income of 20 million. It now has an income of 200 million. It's 20 million, 90% of it was voluntary, unrestricted income. It could do with what it was. It's 180 million, 90% of it is contracts. We are so in league with the state that actually we're unable to call it to account. And I think it's a big issue for the sector, this. We really need to think about the role we have. And actually, small charities in some ways are good at this in terms of their local economies, and some big charities are, but so many of us are so dependent on the state, we've been silenced, or we silenced ourselves, or at worst, we're dampened. So the role of funders ought to be, I think, about funding truly independent organisations that have independent voice, to a civil society that genuinely speaks truth to power in a way that many of us that receive so much money from the state simply cannot, whoever frankly is in power now or in 2024 post-general election. Our role ought to be create a civic space and debate, not just based on political opinion, because it's not about our opinions, but drawing from the lived reality of the people that we know through the work that we do, and reflecting that, reflecting the needs if you're poor, if you're black, if you're gay, if you're trans, if you're an ex-prisoner, if you're a sex worker, if you're a refugee who's just arrived to the country, or you're disabled, to begin to frame a different political debate, so that equity and justice, inclusion and compassion at the heart of that first, not as an adjunct to capital, with this naive idea that money will simply trickle down, but central to who we are as a society, what matters in our society. And I think the sector has a big role in that, a role in determining what Britain will look and feel like in this new area. Now, am I optimistic? Well, funders, there are funders who are beginning to get into the space. A lot of funders are thinking about systems thinking. A lot of funders are beginning to ask some fundamental questions about their wealth. organisations like ESME, Paul Hamlin, Lankelly, Tudor, very, very openly at the moment, really considering the issues about the wealth. And funders are a bit like London buses. Once something starts in the funding world, it tends to move on. We saw that with 360 degrees. Now all our funding is in transparent. Who would have imagined a decade ago that you could look at a website that tells you where billions and billions of funding from tens of funders will be there transparently for you? But my big question to the sector, whether you're a funder or whether you're a mainstream charity, is to ask some fundamental questions about our role in civic society today and as we go forward in the next decade. If you agree with my context, which is a bleak one, we cannot continue to pick up the pieces of a broken society because there are just too many of them. They're too big in number, they're too big in size, they're too complex. We have to step back and look at that whole jigsaw, and that means collective voice. And I support Oxfam, I think it's a great charity actually. I received this is my last flash, Voices, which is Oxfam's magazine. That's, I think, what we have to be about. Collective, strong voice, working together rather than competing with each other for contracts. Drawn not from polemic or opinion, but practice from the people that we know, bringing their voices. So my take home, Carol, as we close, is to really leave you with a call for arms, is actually to consider that context. Of course, we need to deal with the poverty of today. And as funders, we try to do that, but recognise our limited role in doing that. And actually, the problem in us doing that in funders. For funders, we need to be funding advocacy organisations that begin to change the political debate. And few of us do. The nearest foundation that gets to that is the Resolution Foundation, to some extent French Provident, that begin to change that political discourse. I think as organisations, as a collective whole, we have to do that if we're going to have a society that cares about equity, justice, inclusion and compassion during a time of very severe fiscal constraint. So I leave that with you, Carol. We're going to go on, I know, and it'd be really good to hear from Ed, because Ed does some fantastic work with many of the organisations we would support, actually, in terms of supporting them more practically. But I hope that kind of frames it, and I will switch off my camera, and I'm very happy to join for Q&As later on, Carol. But thank you very much for inviting me. It is an honour to speak here. I think you is such an important organisation, because education is the leg up that many people need, and you provide it to people who otherwise wouldn't have it. So I'm a great fan of the OU. But thank you very much indeed, and over to you, Carol.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for leaving us already at this time in the morning with a call to arms. And I love the way you sort of frame that as what we need to do is to reframe the debate, to change the debate, to open up space for dialogue. So I'm sure there will be lots of questions coming, and we'll come to Q&A with Paul and Ed in a few minutes. So do start to post your questions. But now I'd like to hand over to Ed. Thank you, Ed. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Sorry, Ed, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you, Heidi. Hello, everybody. This is my first time on Teams and Zoom. No, it's not, but it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Paul as well for setting out our context and background for this conference. Pilotlight is an organisation, a charity that supports charities. We work with business to provide teams of business experts to come in to support charities. We've worked with over 160 charities over the last year. That was a kind of record for us. And so what I'm going to share this morning draws on our learning and our experience from those charities focused on issues of poverty. And I'm going to focus on some of the difficult choices that we see that those charities need to make. But I'm going to come back. I'm not going to share slides the whole time. Just to start off really where Paul left us, with the sense that there is a multi-dimensional set of challenges and a real crisis facing the charity sector. You know, in short, that what we do as charities is urgently needed, but is less resourced than ever. And, you know, I call this the stress and the impact of this at an individual charity level, whether it's the waiting list that Paul described for survivors of sexual abuse or others, describe this as a scissors effect, so that needs are up. but cash funding is down. So for charities, the cost of living crisis is as much an opportunity to help people who are in need as the pandemic was, but it's no less risk to charities themselves, because many of us go into this weakened by the pandemic with less reserves, less discretionary spending, and less volunteers to help out. Those charities that are relying on local authority contracted services, I know, are also struggling with higher costs and no uplift through their contracts. So many charities are talking of staff burnout, challenges of retention and recruitment, and those are common. And donations-based charities face many similar challenges. Now, at the start of the pandemic, there were siren voices that said that up to 1 in 3 charities were likely to close. That always, to me, seemed unlikely, because my rule of thumb is that when voluntary organisations are under threat, they become more voluntary. Charities with 1 or 2 members of staff, for example, may need to become perforce entirely volunteer run, typically through their trustees. So it's hard to start a charity, but it's also hard to kill one. And there is a resilience characteristic of charities, that we have a purpose that moves people to act, and we have a culture that allows for different forms of participation. We reshape and we reorganize. But even so, again, in the context of lower financial reserves, we are seeing closures. We were supporting one charity here in last week at Pilotlight, and it looks as if they will need to be closing simply for contracts not coming through. And we've seen others. We've seen support bodies, including support bodies for small charities, Coalition for Efficiency, Small Charities Coalition themselves closing. One of Cornwall's leading mental health charities, Sea Sanctuary, closed not too long ago. They tried to run a crowdfunder to save the charity, but it was too little, too late. Having said that, we've got 100 people or more on this conference, 190 signed up over the day, and all of us will be coming from very different charities. And I kind of like to say that if you've seen one charity, you've seen one charity. We are colourful, we are eclectic, and we are diverse as well. Some sectors absolutely are seeing huge pressures, and a shout out to refugee and asylum seeker charities, inspiring in their work, who just face extraordinary pressures, accelerated by operating in such an adversarial and changing policy context alongside all of the other pressures that other charities face. But in other sectors, such as the fast-growing food justice sector, some charities are seeing income increases. For example, as people switch from donating food to donating money to buy. The food bank body, Trussell Trust, has had a 5-fold increase in its income over the last 5 years. So in this talk, I'm going to look at 4 tips drawn from our work at Pilotlight, with stories for each, perhaps to help you and to help your charity if you are facing tough decisions. They're not comprehensive, but neither are they comfortable. And the first tip is this, that sometimes you have to focus in order to move forward. And the example I'm going to talk about is a youth charity on the Holloway Road in North London, Prospects. And just over 10 years ago, they were up, in their words, I hope this is Open University okay language, in their words, they were up shit creek. I think we might recognise that challenge. They had a financial crisis. Core funding had ended, was coming close to ending. One worker felt so stressed that he was on the edge of a heart attack. And the team met in the local pub and decided to bring in support to work with Pilotlight and also to face up to the crisis. And working with a team of business experts, we call them Pilotlighters, what they focused on was the need to bring focus to their work. They moved from 10 services that they were offering young people to 3 priorities and engaged with their funders successfully to secure some emergency support. The lead youth worker, Beef, stepped up to become a wonderfully capable charity leader with all the charisma that comes from deep lived experience and empathy for those the charity is there kind of for. And after a kind of follow-on pro bono project with Pilotlight, Prospects was chosen as Charity of the Year by the Royal Bank of Scotland, if we're allowed to mention other banks, attracting other funding. And 11 years on, the charity is now thriving, surviving, supporting a wide range of young people, including one Ria born actually in the year of their crisis. So the lesson is that it's quite natural for services to spread over time, but when times are hard, it helps to be clear-eyed and focused on what your primary purpose is and is not. And ultimately, you can draw on advice, but the ultimate ownership rests with trustees to work out what's the best configuration to meet the mission of the charity over time. And it's sensitive, often heartrending when you have to stop a service. Click engagement, crowdfunders can help perhaps in emergency, but they can also make it harder if you face a wash of criticism. And the way to be sensitive when there are tough decisions to make is to draw on your existing values. In the case of Prospects, that was about being honest, focused on solutions and being supportive at times of great difficulty. And those values serve for them rather than reaching for something new and probably inauthentic. It's hard to step up in the face of challenge, as Beef did, as chief exec now. And running a charity can feel like it's walking a tightrope. And it's only when you get to the other side that you can fully breathe. And perhaps only then when you can look back and see what you've achieved with your teams, what skills you have unlocked. And we don't all make it through, and certainly should be understanding and supportive of when others don't or when we don't. And that takes me on to my second tip. The first one was about focus and focusing on primary purpose. The second tip is to take the right risks, recognizing it's what you are there for. And an example that we've worked with is charity Rowan Alba, which supports people affected by homelessness in Edinburgh, many of them with complex long-term issues themselves. And the chief exec, Helen, had identified that the real challenge they had was securing appropriate accommodation in Edinburgh. There's spiraling property prices. The charity just can't compete with commercial landlords. So drawing on work with a team of Pilotlighters, in fact, from Barclays Bank, a third bank there, Rowan Alba created a cooperative investment vehicle to raise capital, community shares, to enable the charity to buy its own residential home. And in partnership with Common Ground Against Homelessness, Rowan Alba raised £715,000 of patient investment in support of a new centre for street homeless men in Edinburgh's Pfeffermill. And clearly some big risks came with this, but Helen actually put some of the value of her own home into it as a member of investor, and the charity is growing its services as a result. I'm a member investor myself, but with no house on the line, but I've loved watching this progress. And often when you hear about risk management and risk governance, it's always framed as an exercise in helping organizations to identify and reduce our risks. But for charities, this is always more complex because our purpose is to reduce and sometimes take on the risks that are faced in society by vulnerable people. Charities have to be risk takers. We have to act in solidarity. And I've written before, and I'll pop it in the chat in case it's easier to have a look through, that we should expect there to be charity failures. If Kids Company was a risky venture, I wrote, which no one seems to dispute, one reason was that it was trying to tackle a rising toll of risks to children and to society. And many charities do this, and we should celebrate what they do as loudly and proudly as we do risk takers in enterprise and in investment. Good governance is critical, yes, but we should accept failure, accept that in a world of risk, charities will try things and some will fail. The charity sector should be valued overall for how well we reduce risks to society, and we should be judged by how effectively we do that overall. So find your courage at your board level, with your staff, with your volunteers, with your funders and stakeholders, with your users. Find your courage and take the right risks. Now, my third tip is to find your financial balance. Now, because we bring pro bono support from the business sector, we're seeing more organizations come to us for support on income diversification, and quite a lot of developing new social enterprises. Been working, for example, with the Women's Refuge in Coventry around a social enterprise for accrediting universities and other organizations around tackling sexual violence. It's kind of brilliant model because it's trading, but its primary purpose is not running a cafe to raise money to run for the charity. So that's a huge area we see of interest at the moment. How do we diversify our income? And funding pots is down, investment income is down for foundations. Funders are going back to some of their old ways, at least in terms of not being as flexible as they were brilliantly during the pandemic. But income diversification is a complex one, and it can be in tension with my first piece of advice, which is to focus on your primary purpose. And actually, over the pandemic, we saw that charities who had diversified successfully through social enterprise models were typically hit harder than those relying on grants. And also that emergency funding pots led to a lot of innovation, such as local service charities going national with digital services, women's charities finding housing for homeless men like the Venus Charity in Bootle, or food banks working with local authorities in new joined up ways. But some of that innovation also represented mission drift, which comes with its own challenges in that resource constrained world. And it's for that reason that I tend to talk about finding your financial balance rather than income diversification for its own sake. How can you sustain income over time? And examples of charities we're working with at the moment: Improving Lives in Nottinghamshire supports people with complex health and social needs. There's great, amazing work they do in terms of mental health support. Grew significantly following the pandemic because, of course, there's so much needs that are there. But they've got a big lottery grant, which is set to end in kind of early 2025, and that could be a cliff edge. So they need a robust plan to look at and attract alternative funding sources. Now, I think one other thing I'd say is that don't assume that funders, and Paul, I hope you don't shoot me for this, but don't assume that funders have less money to give. In fact, I understand from colleagues at the Directory for Social Change, which produce super useful guides to foundations, that while more people are approaching foundations, they're asking for less money. And that's a sort of form of self-censorship, perhaps. And there are still opportunities out there in terms of public support. We are seeing a decline in individual donations, but in the excellent data from the Charities Aid Foundation, I can see that, 1 in 3 people, 1 in 3 adults last year in the population were not asked to give to charities, were not asked at any point over the year. And actually that's a number, 36%, which has increased over the last few years. So as always, find ways to ask, and people are often pleased to be asked, even in tough times. And of course, make the most of every donation, whether encouraging direct debit or using the gift aid scheme. And the fourth area or the fourth tip that I have alongside focus, take the right risks, and find your financial balance is to understand what pro bono support can do for you. And I'm just going to come back to some slides here. These are the 4 tips. There is a world of pro bono, free pro bono support for charities. It's not particularly well known and it's slightly fragmented. So we're looking to work in a collaborative way with others in the field to make it easier to access support that is out there, and working with sister organisations, Cranfield Trust, which do brilliant kind of work, Skill Volunteers, Reach Volunteering, which is a brilliant place to find new trustees and treasurers, are fabulous on using open recruitment to build more diverse boards. But then over 30 other organisations that provide pro bono support in some way. And over the last year, we as a field, we've supported over 8,000 charities and social enterprises. 7 out of 10 small charities are looking for support in terms of professional skills, but only 4 in 10 find it. And in fact, in Small Charities Week coming up in 3 weeks' time, I think with the support of the Lloyds Bank Foundation, Small Charities Week will be kind of celebrating small charities, but our own contribution to that is that the Pro Bono Association members will be launching a commitment to signpost and refer between ourselves to make it easier for charities to provide the support that you need. And to explain some of the programs that we run longer form organizational development programs, and that Pilotlight is perhaps, if we are known, we are best known for that. But we also run programs that are shorter, and I'll just share a couple of these in case these look of interest to you. And this is our shortest program, which is 90 minutes. And it's a closely facilitated time trying to get a diverse range of brilliant skills and backgrounds into a room from business and charity sector to help a charity with a specific challenge. So maybe how can we fill a short-term income gap? Another one was a charity saying, well, we've got a property in a kind of a popular part of town. How do we monetize the property to raise income? And in 90 minutes, what you do is generate a kind of a large number of different ideas that are there. And if you're that stage when you're looking for new ideas, the Brain Trust is a great model. We work with charities around an impact day where we bring teams of people from typically one firm together to provide support. And this was from an impact day we ran recently with the firm KPMG in Manchester. Anyone from Manchester, you might know the KPMG offices just off St. Peter's Square. It's got that lovely view of the kind of red lights and as dark comes down of the cranes over Manchester, and supporting Survivors Manchester. And Duncan, who is the chief exec kind of there, talked about being blown away by the enthusiasm and the allyship of people with skills coming to support him and the charity around some practical challenges that they face to generate new ideas and new ways forward. So that's a little bit about some of the programs of support that we provide and are there. And I'll pop some links on in the chat for you. But these are difficult times, and let me just stop kind of sharing. These are tough times, and in the charity sector, we're called on to make tough decisions. So we're no more shielded from those decisions, as Fidèle was describing at the start of this event, than those on whose behalf we are working. And what we can do, what we need to do, is to draw on our own strengths when we have to make these decisions, working together where possible, recognizing our own vulnerabilities, stepping back from blame, saving our outrage for something else, for tackling the system that Paul described as keeping people in poverty and exclusion and racial injustice. Because when we can change a destructive economy with those cycles of neglect and exclusion and discrimination, when we can build together an economy of hope and care that is health generating, that is inclusive, that is sustainable, that's what we want to do. And the toughest decision is this, that we each do what we can to advance a world in which everyone matters, in which the social sector is not a frayed social safety net for those in need, but a true expression of the joy of shared, voluntary and mutual action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. I'm going to invite Paul as well to join us, and we're going to go into a Q&A session. But thank you first, both of you, and thank you for taking us absolutely from the macro to the micro of that, you know, sort of detail of support that can be given, and for sharing some free resources with us there, Ed. As we've had a number of people typing saying, can you share resources? Can you share? My colleagues will share during this Q&A session and my wrap up to this session, but also just to assure everybody that we will send links to resources as well in the email that will follow this conference. So please don't think we're not going to share of that. We will do. So just so many issues being raised there. Thank you, both of you. I'm going to start with the question. Paul, I could see you were responding to one or two of these already, but there's a question there about the accountability of charities, and somebody was saying that public sector organisations are obviously accountable to the public because at the end of the day we can turn up and vote. But what's the accountability of charities? Would you, Paul, perhaps you go to that as you started to respond online, and then Ed, maybe you would come back to it, please.
I kind of think it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I think good charities are accountable to their public and need to demonstrate that. And we would look as a funder for demonstration of that. One of the problems with a funding model, whether it's a contracting model or a grant funding model, is it inverts it. If we fund for projects, then suddenly the charity becomes accountable to us. Or if it's a contract, it becomes accountable to its local authority. And, you know, we want to invert that and say, actually, you're accountable to your local public, and you need to demonstrate how you do that. And accountable doesn't just mean you do the odd survey or you occupy an advisory event. Are they on your board? Are they helping design your services? Are they working with you? For often with small local organisations, there'll be people with lived experience already on the board or involved in the organisation in different ways. I mean, many small charities are set up by somebody who experienced domestic abuse or homelessness or refugees or whatever it might be. So it's kind of bedded in. But I would differentiate between your public and the public. We don't have a responsibility to the Daily Mail reader who may have a particular view on refugees that we would not necessarily share. We do have a responsibility to our public, who are, if you're a refugee organisation, the people who arrived on the boat, you know, 3 days ago from Montreal because they've just come through appalling human rights persecution. You absolutely have that, and you need to demonstrate that. And if you're not doing that, then I think it's a really good question.
Ed, do you want to jump in on this topic? Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. And I think that accountability is something that should worry us in the charity sector, because we know over time and over history, the charity sector has been paternalist, It's been racist. It's reflected patriarchal views and attitudes. And some of that comes from the resources that are coming into the sector, from the power structures that reflect those values. And it's been accountability that has driven change. The accountability of #CharitySoWhite as a campaign challenge, or the challenge of, working with users. I mean, the extraordinary shift in the disabled persons movement, in the setup, the formal structure, but also the operations of charities working on issues affecting disabled persons, has all come from accountability claimed by disabled persons themselves. And, it's an extraordinary story during the pandemic of how some really far forward thinking disabled persons organizations took on the challenges facing disabled persons over the pandemic. The exclusion and discrimination that they were facing in governmental legislation, they campaigned to change it. They did it within 6 months, and all of that because it came from that groundswell of people participating in charities. Now, the complexity is that we just have we have an unclear form of accountability, because charities are trustee models. Some of those trustee models are accountable to wider members, so the trustees are on, but many, if not most, are trustees essentially self-selecting. So that there is a kind of grey space that's here, and similar to what Paul was saying, it introduces an ambiguity which we can use to our advantage. If we embrace accountability, it means that you can have volunteers on your board, you can have staff on your board, you can have users on your board. It's what the great academic Howard Glenister from the London School of Economics, if I can mention a different academic institution, said was the distinctive advantage of voluntary organizations is their ambiguity. And what he meant by that is that we're able to bring stakeholders together in these complex patterns of inclusion. But we have to talk about accountability, and we have to mean accountability. That's the most important thing, that accountability is being, giving an account of what you've done, but also being held to account by those you work with. And, governance is a key issue. The trustees have to be challenging and have to reflect the interests of those key stakeholder groups to challenge the charity to keep on board. And so above all, I'd look to the board. Good question, great subject, probably a day's conference in itself.
I was just going to say, I think we could be discussing this one all day today, and I'm conscious I've got a few more questions, but great responses, thank you. And a really great indication that practicing accountability can actually address some of those structural issues, as well as just addressing those mechanics of good governance. So really, really important. There was a question about risk. So I think both of you, Paul, I'm not sure you used the word risk, but in a way, risk was also there when you were encouraging us to step out into some of these complex kind of spaces. But maybe Ed, to you first, because you specifically addressed the issue of risk. And Paul, I know again you started to respond to this, but somebody asked, from an investor perspective on risk, why would we think that charities are more risky than startup tech ventures, who we have seen can pull in huge amounts of money, operate for years without becoming profitable, and lately fall with spectacular consequences? That's from one of my my OU colleagues. Do you want to comment on that, please, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, it is funny, isn't it, that the whole tech development and big tech is basically running on non-profit models, but of course they don't make a profit, but they see they see appreciation in their stock value, and that's all about future earnings. So there is a process of capital accumulation that's going on there. But of course, any investor knows that investing in startup businesses is very, very risky indeed, and investing in tech startups is no different to that. There will be a significant failure kind of rate. So why should we expect anything different from the charity sector? Well, quite right. I think the charity sector is more sustainable in institutional terms over time because of its participatory nature, because people step up when they need to in that way, and that is a great difference. But the point is right, is that if we're trying to do difficult things, we should recognize that it's risky. It's easy just to assume when things go wrong that we should rush to blame, and people may have you know, there's, I think, some research saying when people give money to charities, they want to believe that that is going to tackle the problem, that it's going to solve the problem. And in the charity sector, we know it's much, much harder and it's much riskier to do so. So I think my plea and focus on risk is simply to recognise the risks that we face as charities, but also to be conscious about responding to it. And as I say, there's so much simple risk management, which says just reduce your risks. What are your mitigating actions? What do you do less of? Whereas actually, I think that the most courageous and innovative charities that we're seeing, as innovative as any tech companies, are those that are taking on and reducing the risks of those they're working for.
Thank you, Ed. Paul?
Well, yeah, I mean, Ed said it. I don't think there is less risk than there is in tech companies. I think that charities are inherently resilient, and we saw that. I mean, they go up and down in terms of size and scale. We see that. I've got a slide, community links, actually. We look at community links as a case study. Thinking was down here. It went up right there and dropped right down again, but it's still there. I mean, you could argue it may not be in the future, but it's still there. They're incredibly resilient. I mean, there are some risks. I mean, some of the risks that we would look at in an organisation that would mean we couldn't fund it would be things like safeguarding. If your safeguarding isn't right, you move on people, we're not going to fund you, basically. I mean, we look at marginal things like GDPR, but those things can be fixed, but safeguarding is fundamental. And there are bigger risks, I think, about accountability, your operating model. You know, does your governance body properly bring in the people who are there? Or is it really, as Ed has said, very paternalistic? Are people who are genuinely part of the organisation right at the centre of your governance? Financial risks, I mean, often charities can't afford decent finance people, but again, that's manageable. I mean, one of the great things that Ed does and we do is provide support to organisations that help to evolve their kind of core infrastructure, because we wouldn't like to not fund an organisation because its core infrastructure is a bit shaky if it's doing great work on the ground. So you can fix the back office with support. And there is support out there. I mean, Ed's mentioned people like Cranfield, some of that's pro bono. There's some really good providers. It's not just us. There's a number of people in the network that Ed has set up that provide pro bono support to organisations. The trick is recognising that, and many organisations kind of ignore it, because the classic thing in small charities, you get somebody who's brilliant on the front line, who's never been a leader in their life, who suddenly becomes a chief executive, and it terrifies them because they've never looked at a bunch of accounts in their life. The bigger risk, I would say, is strategic risk. The bigger risk is that we look at the scale of the problem, we think the answer is we're going to get a little bit bigger, and it's not, actually. For most of the issues we're addressing, I see charities time and time again that say, we really love what we do, we'd like to double its size. And if they double its size, they'll still be infinitesimal in terms of the demand, which for me, the argument is, what can you do beyond the direct support to influence the system in which you work in whatever way you can? Yeah, it might be the local authority, it might be a contracting body, but use the information. And that is a strategic risk, because the risk is we think by getting a bit bigger, we're the answer. We're not. We never will be. Some of these systemic risks are going to have to be dealt with in a different kind of way. But we can be the answer for that if we draw from what we know from our practice and reflect that in a work around influence.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, I'm jumping between these questions because there are quite a few and they're big meaty questions. We won't get through them all, but I'm going to go for at least one more and we'll see whether we've got time for one final one. So somebody commented earlier that there can be a paradox in funding, which is the kind of drawing of funding towards large organisations, and particularly sort of the sense perhaps that you have to sort yourself out in order to get funding. So they're kind of, I think, Paul, you began to talk there about some of the things that organisations maybe haven't addressed yet. And how do you fund organisations? How do you ensure that the funding goes to small organisations, even if they don't yet have capacity to address all of the kind of governance issues, or they've not yet you mentioned GDPR there, Paul, is something they maybe haven't addressed yet. So how do you ensure that funding goes to smaller organisations on the ground and doesn't distract them from actually doing the work, because they want to focus on doing the work? I'm linking a couple of comments and questions there together, but Paul, do you want to come on that one first? Because I know at the Foundation you've specifically tried to ensure that funding does go to small organisations.
Yeah, well, we only fund small organisations, so I'd say about 500,000. I mean, in voluntary sector terms, of course, the majority of our sector is less than 10,000 with no employees, so we need to recognise that. So we're funding medium-sized organisations. You know, the premise that large organisations do this stuff better is just blatantly wrong. Large organisations are really good at doing standardised, multiple work. We see it in the NHS, we see it in the public sector, really good at doing. What they are not great at is dealing with really complex issues and really complex support for people. And we think the irony is that small local organisations are better able to do that than large organisations, and that's why we fund them. And I think the answer is that actually, I mean, one of the reasons that we do, and a number of funders do some of this sort of support, but the reason we do the sort of stuff that Ed does with his organisation in terms of providing support around areas like governance and GDPR and all that kind of stuff is exactly because we don't want to not fund a brilliant coal-face organisation if it doesn't have some of that stuff fixed. So I think, but I'll go back to most small charities tend not to recognise that or ignore it. And there is a capacity question, clearly, because it's all very well, Ed, or we putting a consultant in to advise them. In the end, somebody has to do something afterwards. So there's a capacity question. But I think for funders, the message would be more unrestricted funding so people can use it as they wish, not how we determine, not project funding. And think about the infrastructure support. Even if you're not an organisation like us that provides it, there are loads of people like Cranfield or Pilotlight who you can point to get that kind of support and to recognise it, not hide it under the carpet, because we can fund that sort of stuff because we have that sort of support. But it is true, if you're going to some of the larger funders that are very lean, I mean, most funders give a lot of money, but they don't have big staff groups to support them. They may well rule you out simply because your GDPR isn't pucker. Well, that's a bit sad, isn't it? So you do need to attend to those things, but there are ways in which you can do the analysis to understand what the issues are. And then I think you have to think about that in parallel with with the kind of work at the front of office, if you like. But there is support out there for that, and I think people need to draw on that.
Brilliant, thank you. And Ed, from you.
No, I don't think I have anything to add. We're not a funder, so I see the challenges and the kind of unintended barriers that kind of funders may put up towards small charities accessing them. But I'm afraid I've got no insight to bring to add on.
That's
that,
okay.
Karen.
Don't worry. Therefore, I'm going to just jump in with another one, which I don't know whether I'm not sure whether we can answer this one. But somebody raised a question about academic funding, and particularly about UKRI, which is where we gather much of our research funding from, and the difficulties. And I've experienced this myself, and I'm sure other academic colleagues on the call have difficulty of directing money from academic sources into the sector. And I just wondered if either of you have any experience of working alongside perhaps academic funding. I don't know if that's something you've encountered.
It's a great model where it can work, Carol, and we have to start with the idea that actually the researchers and the practitioners are interested in different things. The practitioners are interested in research to get good ideas to improve practice. And the researchers are interested in the practice in order to generate good ideas. So, it could be a virtuous circle, but of course you've got different languages and different ways of approaching things, different institutional logics. So research funding, for example, is very slow as far as I can see. It's like Mandarin to me.
It is indeed.
and it's slightly obscure, but then the practitioners we move to much kind of faster timeframes, when actually you need to take time to really kind of reflect on what you're doing and generate the data that to take the time to do all of those building blocks. So I do think it's a huge opportunity. I've been on the board of a program called Connected Communities, which was a cross-research council program, which was wonderful at generating and promoting the idea of research partnerships and co-creation between researchers and practitioners. So I know that there's some good practice out there. And at the moment in the pro bono field, we've got the benefit of a PhD student starting at an eminent business school. It's not the Open University, unfortunately. And, this is going to be so helpful to have somebody alongside us for 4 years who is understanding what we do, but also using our networks, our access, our data in order to help us learn and grow. So great opportunities if we can just solve the institutional frameworks that make these things more difficult, then that would be great. But let me know what placard and how many people you want outside as a demonstration of which research council, and we'll get onto it.
We might be talking to you about that. Paul, do you have any comments on this?
I've got 4 P's for you. So my first P is partner with us, don't pitch to us, because we're not going to fund your academic research just because you pitch to us. If you partner with us, and this was a brilliant case study of partnering with the OU, with IVAR, with Sheffield Hallam to produce a really. So my second two P's are: we're not interested in publications, we're interested in practice. You know, we're not interested in you creating fantastic CVs so that you can tout yourself around the academic world, which is what you have to do for academic. Completely get that. We're interested in practice change. And so, you know, I've done a lot of work in medical research. I ran Diabetes UK. The issue there is that everybody wants to fund the leading edge innovative stuff that will get them a Nobel Prize. The big issue in diabetes care is not the stuff that's going to get you a Nobel Prize. It's implementing what we already know. Health services research. It's not sexy, but it's going to create more difference to more lives. And that, I think, is where the money is going to be, actually, particularly in social research. We've got to get a lot better at practice and thinking through some of them are quite tedious questions, but important questions, like the value of small. It was an incredibly powerful piece of research. I think it cost £250,000. That's a lot of money for us. That's half a dozen charities that didn't get a grant. So the opportunity cost of that is significant. So, you know, we will always look at that. So we're not going to fund research infrastructure, although people like Wolfson do. I mean, people ought to look at Wolfson, actually. Wolfson are a really good academic research funder, and they fund a range of stuff. Garfield Westerville do some of that stuff. I mean, it's not our forte. So they're out there, but I would say partner with us, don't pitch, and don't worry about your publications. We're interested in practice change. Help us with that.
Thank you so much. I think that last one is well, for us in Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership, it's a constant debate about how we close that virtuous circle and make sure that we speak to practice and also into academia and into the more theoretical work as well, and attend to institutional pressures, as you began to describe there. So that's a really important one for those of us that are academics. More importantly, though, thank you so much for the breadth of issues that you have addressed. Thank you, Ed and Paul. Really appreciate this framing for our conference today. I think it's really set us up in a great position, and you've addressed some of those really big macro issues and you've pointed them out to us. We kind of know, but it's so great to have them, you know, brought right in front of us, I think, as we come into these issues. Thank you so much, Ed, for talking about some of the free access, the pro bono resources. We also work with Cranfield Trust. We know them quite well, and so brilliant to draw attention to the breadth of organisations that are doing that kind of work. Myself and my colleague Daniel Haslam also work quite closely with local infrastructure organisations and with the national organisation NAVCA, where we've done some work with them. So we're you know, always talking about infrastructure organisations and the importance of them. And indeed, Daniel and myself both worked in local infrastructure before we came to the university. So thank you for touching on so many points that are absolutely at our heart in CVSL, but I'm sure are really important to our attendees today. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I just have 5 more minutes to just wrap up this session, and then there's going to be a tea break, everybody, at 11:15. So if you're beginning to be a bit thirsty, don't worry, that tea break is on the way. Just to say that my colleagues have been sharing resources, and I know that Ed and Paul have also shared links, so please do follow those links to resources. We'll be sharing some resources as well from the Open University, so some of our free resources on our free platform OpenLearn, which you probably know from some of the TV programs where you have the line, follow the links to the Open University to our free platform. But there are also resources that are specifically around voluntary sector issues. For example, there's some courses for us on leadership in the voluntary sector. There's a course around involving volunteers. There's a course which didn't come from us but came from some colleagues around using volunteering to get ahead in work. We are also working with OU in Wales to offer a course for volunteers developing their skills. So there's quite a few free resources from us. We've also been doing some work on digital, which often is seen as one way to address some of the issues and some of the capacity issues. So there's some free resources there as well that we've been working on with partners from across Europe over the last 3 years at eu3digital.com, and a recent webinar we did on getting started in digital. So if you're still trying to work that out post-COVID and there's a lot to think about, you can follow the link to our webinar there and listen to my colleague Tot Foster, talk about how to get started on digital issues. So we're going to be posting all of those. We'll send them to you in the follow-up as well, but please do follow the link. We also, you just see that online, you're going to have these constant polls. So we encourage you to join us in the polls. We want to make sure that we're providing content that's really useful to people. That's as we're a group of academics, but we also want this to be useful to practice as well as to our academic colleagues. So please do on this session, just respond to the poll, and there will be a poll on every session. Also, just to say, I was really excited to see the poll right at the beginning about where people are joining us from. So I jumped in first and went Leicestershire, which is, I have to say, very sunny Leicestershire today, very exciting. And my tomato plants are thriving in my window just in front of me. So I'm looking through it, a little bit of green with my tomato plants and outside at the sun. But we in a minute, you will have a moment just to step outside or just, you know, get up for a few minutes, have a stretch, and then come back and join us. So the tea break is going to start in just 1 minute, and then I'm just checking the time that we'll be back. We'll be back at 11:30. So all you need to do is to switch your just step away from the screen. That's absolutely fine. You can leave the link open, or you can be following some of the links in the chat if you want to during the break once you've got your cup of tea, and just join us again please at 11:30.